Thank you. Good morning. Journey and race, cultural appropriation in corporate rock. Just a small town girl living in a lonely world. Few lyrics have so closely captured the identity of a listener and the zeitgeist of an era. Don't Stop Believin' was released in October 1981 to rapidly ascend the Billboard Hot 100. In its 50-year history, Journey has sold more than 90 million albums, including 40 million of their 1981 number one LP, Escape, which contains Don't Stop Believin' and four other hits. Their 1988 greatest hits album returned to the Billboard album chart 20 years later, where it remains after an astonishing 700 weeks. Only Bob Marley's Legend and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon have enjoyed longer runs. They sold just over 1 million tickets on their last full tour at an average ticket price just under $100. Today, Journey is one of the most popular touring bands on a billion-dollar heritage circuit, and that song has continued to influence popular culture, from the 2003 film Monster to the final scene of The Sopranos, from the TV show Glee to its adoption as an underdog anthem by several professional baseball teams. Like so much of what has moved American history, Journey's popularity has to do with race. It was made possible by a unique combination of Black-oriented Motown and white-oriented progressive rock, a cultural appropriation made palatable to the post-civil rights white teenage audience. Prior to the advent of rock and roll, popular music was segregated. Blues, gospel, jazz, and ragtime had been considered race music because of their origins in the African-American community and appeal to Black listeners. People of color were considered racial, while white people were considered normal and therefore without race. White audiences enjoyed country, music hall, operetta. Their exposure to race music was through acceptable white interlocutors like the jazz impresario Paul Whiteman, white gospel, and of course, minstrelsy, the original cultural appropriation. For a brief moment at mid-century, rock and roll integrated popular music. The genre took seed in a time of national optimism following victory in World War II, much as jazz had grown in popularity after the First World War. It flowered during the social revolution of the 1960s, much as jazz had during the Roaring '20s. The baby boom generation was reordering society, or at least they were trying. This revolution integrated popular music at the same time as it integrated buses, public schools, lunch counters, and Star Trek. Quote, rock and roll did more for integration than the church, said civil rights leader Andrew Young, who succeeded Martin Luther King as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Quote, and if I was going to choose who I was going to let into the kingdom, I might have to choose Elvis. While it lasted, it was glorious. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and other pioneers combined Delta blues, country, gospel, and rockabilly. British bluesmen like John Mayall, Peter Green, and Eric Clapton explicitly duplicated the Black Delta sensibility. Aretha Franklin borrowed from Mick Jagger and Mick from Aretha. The Santana Blues Band combined mariachi heritage with Afro-Cuban rhythms and psychedelic surf, joining Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone for a triumphant performance before an interracial audience at Woodstock. Often in spite of their parents, baby boom teenagers ate it all up. Rock and roll seemed to be leading the way to an interracial future and having a lot of fun doing so. It ended with disillusionment thanks to the war in Vietnam, the urban crisis, and stagflation, much as the promise of the Roaring '20s ended with the Great Depression. As society sought familiarity in old patterns, popular music resegregated too. By the 1970s, with the South forced to integrate, the battle for civil rights moved to the North, where it stalled over busing, affirmative action, and police brutality. Oil shocks, deindustrialization, and recession replaced the optimism of the 1950s with an overwhelming anxiety, a sense of malaise. The nation saw a backlash against the achievements of the civil rights era and opposition to the war in Vietnam. As the hippies, peace signs, and patchouli receded, Presley was replaced by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Led Zeppelin eclipsed the British blues, and Santana disintegrated. Cutting-edge Black artists abandoned the inoffensive rhythm of Motown as their brethren in the civil rights movement turned to more militant forms of protest, spurning Chuck Berry and Ray Charles for Sam and Dave and James Brown. Rock and roll resegregated, dividing into rock, primarily performed by and marketed to a white audience, and soul, which was by and for Black people. By 1973, one could no longer hear Marvin Gaye on the same station as the Allman Brothers, despite their similar musical structure and roots. Journey was founded in December of that year by manager Herbie Herbert, guitar prodigy Neil Schon, and singer-organist Greg Raleigh, all formerly of Santana, with Steve Miller's former bass player and a rhythm guitarist who had worked with the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia. They were soon joined by noted British blues drummer Ainsley Dunbar, who had worked with David Bowie and Frank Zappa. These were young, energetic musicians at the cutting edge of musicality and closely tuned to the latest currents in popular music. They were a supergroup, and they promptly failed to meet expectations. 50 years later, Journey is one of the most popular touring bands on a multi-million-dollar nostalgia circuit. Neil Schon remains in the band with longtime pianist, songwriter Jonathan Cain. Neither the 1973 Journey nor its 2022 version, however, fully represents the band's history, as neither includes the individual most closely associated with its sound. That is singer Steve Perry, who led Journey to superstardom and whose controversial departure still represents its most devastating loss. Technically proficient and immensely talented musicians Perry joined in 1977 were under threat of losing their contract with Columbia Records. No album since he left the band has received either lasting airplay or comparable sales. Indeed, in keeping with that 1977 threat, Columbia dropped the band after their first without Perry's emblematic voice. But during his years at center stage, the band experienced an unrivaled heyday at the heart of popular culture. Rock and roll had always been a business, but with the rise of Bob Dylan and the Beatles and the founding of periodicals like Rolling Stone and Cream, some began to see it as an art form untethered to capitalist realities. This was true of the early years of Journey, which produced experimental, progressive jazz fusion rock. Critics called their style heavy space. But the music business remained a business, and successful musicians learned to adapt. In 1981, with a marketing and merchandise operation netting tens of millions of dollars a year, at one point earning $7 million in t-shirts alone, Journey epitomized a trend towards corporate rock, and their formerly hippie manager, Herbie Herbert, epitomized corporate management. He pioneered point-of-sale advertising, pushing retailers to play Journey music in the showrooms. He made all band decisions, from venue choice to contracting minutiae to personnel changes, including hiring and firing band members. He established wholly owned subsidiaries to handle trucking, lighting, and sound for the band's tours so they could profit from rather than pay for these services. He sold corporate sponsorships to the likes of Budweiser beer. He even licensed a Journey video game with a home version as well as a coin-operated one for arcades. It is not to say that Journey was not musically innovative. In fact, like Paul Whiteman and Al Jolson, Journey's musical innovation was in cultural appropriation. It combined the best of rock, Motown, and the blues into a form pleasant to the ears of mostly white teenagers. When Steve Perry crooned, combined his father's big band sound and Portuguese fado ancestry with the Motown of his adolescence, a white Sam Cooke aspiring to be a white James Brown. Neil Schon poured Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix into his guitar solos with an occasional nod to Carlos Santana. Jonathan Cain combined the country music of his Arkansas heritage with the polka of his Chicago youth to a songwriting talent to rival Springsteen. Their most enduring hit, Don't Stop Believin', combines all of these multiracial trans-American elements with a simple, familiar chord progression. It happens to be the same four chords Phil Spector used for the Teddy Bears' 1958 hit, To Know Him Is to Love Him. The Beatles used it for Let It Be, Peter Tosh and Bob Marley for No Woman, No Cry, and the Rolling Stones for Beast of Burden. The lyrics speak to the angst of the era, yearning, wistfulness, transition, and by inverting the sensibility of Jim Weatherly's Midnight Train to Georgia, which spoke of defeat, specifically the failure of most Southern blacks to achieve success in the de facto segregated North, they added a hint of promise, a road out of the darkness into which the country had seemingly fallen. The midnight train going anywhere, accompanied by an accelerating guitar transit. It was the perfect complement to Ronald Reagan's Morning in America, and it appealed to the same electorate. Music and dance allow people to be more in touch with their emotions, especially repressed sexuality. Polite Western European culture considers emotion and sexuality to be carnal, animalistic, and uncivilized, revealing and reveling in instincts better left repressed. Much of the history of racism is based on the idea, generated by white people, slavers, imperialists, and even common folk seeking advantage, that Black people are sexually primitive, childlike, and uncivilized. This has no basis in fact. African Americans and whites engage equally in various sexual behaviors, acceptable and unacceptable, for example. And there is no racial disparity in innate artistic talent. Race is socially constructed and not biologically determined, and natural melanin production is genetically unrelated to natural talents like musical pitch and rhythm. But just as Black people's perceived sexual freedom has titillated repressed whites, Black people's music, dance, and other artistic contributions have been simultaneously marginalized and covertly admired by white people restrained by society's rhythm-denying straitjacket. Actually becoming Black, however, is a bridge too far for most white people. The long history of racial rape, murder, and pillage is well understood, even if publicly denied. White people then have historically sought only a temporary flirtation with dangerous Blackness. That's where minstrelsy came in. Minstrelsy allowed white people to temporarily revel in the rhythms that connected them to their innate barbaric emotions and sexual desires, quote, to escape periodically into an exotic world of pleasure, sensuality, and emotional freedom traditionally denied or suppressed within Western European culture, unquote, as historian Michael Bertrand puts it. Journey's continued popularity in recent decades, both in MP3 downloads and on the largely white Heritage tour circuit, has been no less instructive in how Black musical styles continue to influence white musical tastes. The use of Don't Stop Believin' on The Sopranos is but one example. Albeit fictional, Tony Soprano represents the white suburban teenager of the 1970s, all grown up and no less anxious. The violent plotline stands in for the continuing fears of a generation that moved from Reagan's Morning in America to Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. As music historian Dewar McLeod has written, quote, music shapes our identity, music makes us feel human, music brings us together. Music can also alienate and divide us, unquote. By 2016, Journey was no less caught up in the nation's tribal divisions than were its political parties. The song's meaning and interracial origins allow it to be fluid and dynamic. The band hired a new lead singer, a Filipino named Arnel Pineda, expanding the group's cultural reach to the immigrant community. For him, for so many other fans of color, Don't Stop Believin' is about Dr. King's dream. In 2020, given the opportunity to replace two members, the band chose two Black mainstays of the San Francisco music scene, including bassist A&R executive Randy Jackson, the longtime host of American Idol. In the era of Black Lives Matter, the band once known for rocking the red states became majority minority and reminded the world of the roots and continuing impact of African American music on rock. Meanwhile, Journey remains corporate, a brand as much as a band. Its parent company, Nightmare Productions, Inc., rakes in more than $30 million per year from the band's tours, barring pandemics, and much, much more from sales of the back catalog. It is owned by the 5 musicians who were in the band in 1981, only 2 of whom remain in the group, as well as the estate of former manager Herbie Herbert. Not much has changed since 1981, except that none of this is innovative anymore. My next book, from which today's presentation is taken, will not only tell the story of how changes in race relations since the civil rights era have affected popular music. It will also be a reappraisal of the role of race in rock music, carefully following the development of Journey from a failing progressive rock group to Motown-influenced superstardom. It will demonstrate the continuing importance of resegregation and cultural appropriation in the maturity of rock music. Thank you.